She woke before sunrise on a day that was meant to be ordinary and practical and free of memory, yet the quiet of the morning already carried something heavy inside her chest, because her name was Clara Evans, and she had lived long enough to know that the past never truly stayed quiet when given space to breathe. Clara was 41 years old and worked as a clerk in a modest office where papers moved slowly and voices stayed low and nothing unexpected ever happened. And she had learned to like it that way because stability felt safer than hope after years of learning how quickly hope could be taken away. She lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town, and her life was shaped by routines that protected her from thinking too deeply about what might have been, and each morning followed the same pattern: tea by the window, shoes by the door, keys checked twice. And that morning was no different, except for the reason she was leaving town. Her mother had a medical appointment in the city and Clara had promised to accompany her, but at the last minute her mother insisted she was fine alone and told Clara to use the day for herself, something Clara rarely did. And so she boarded the early train with a book she did not intend to read and thought she could not turn off. The city greeted her with noise and motion, and people walking with purpose and impatience. And as she stepped onto the crowded square, she felt smaller than usual, like a visitor in a life that once might have been hers but was no longer. And she moved carefully through the streets, holding her bag close, as if it contained more than documents and receipts. At the center of the square stood the concert hall, tall and bright, with wide stone steps and banners moving gently in the air, announcing the evening performance of Daniel Cross, the internationally known pianist, whose name was spoken with reverence in music circles, and whose concert sold out weeks in advance. Clara noticed the banners without meaning to, and her steps slowed as she read the name, because it unlocked something she had kept sealed for years, and the sound of piano music that once filled her childhood home rose quietly in her memory, bringing with it the scent of old wood and the weight of unsaid goodbyes. Music had been her first language before adulthood demanded a different voice, and she had learned to play the piano as a girl, sitting on a worn bench beside her father, who believed music taught patience and honesty. And for many years she believed that too, until life took a turn that forced her to choose survival over passion. She had not touched a piano in over 15 years, not because she had forgotten how, but because it hurt to remember who she had been when she played. And standing there in the square, she told herself that noticing the concert hall meant nothing, and that she was only tired from travel. Inside the hall, preparations were already underway for the evening event, and Daniel Cross had arrived earlier than scheduled to rehearse privately. And to escape the expectations that followed him everywhere, and despite his fame, he preferred quiet spaces where sound mattered more than applause. Daniel had been playing since early childhood, and by his mid-30s, his name alone filled rooms, yet he often felt disconnected from the joy that first brought him to the piano. And fame had given him comfort and recognition, but also distance from ordinary life, which he sometimes missed more than he admitted. That morning he had chosen to rehearse on the public piano, placed in the side chamber of the hall where passers-by were occasionally allowed to listen and interact. And he liked the unpredictability of that space, because it reminded him that music belonged to everyone, not just ticket holders. As Clara passed the entrance, she heard the sound of piano drifting through the open doors, and she stopped without realizing it, and stood still as the melody reached her, something simple and reflective, played with precision yet lacking warmth. And she felt a quiet ache because she recognized the skill but not the soul. A small group of people had gathered inside the side chamber, watching Daniel rehearse and whispering his name with excitement and curiosity. And Clara remained at the edge, unsure whether to step in or walk away. And before she could decide, the music stopped, and the room filled with light conversation. Daniel stood from the bench, stretching his hands and smiling at the small crowd, and someone asked him how long he had been playing, and he answered easily, enjoying the exchange. And then his gaze moved across the room and landed briefly on Clara, who stood quietly near the doorway with an expression he could not immediately read. There was something about her stillness that caught his attention, because she was not holding a phone or whispering or trying to be noticed. And instead she listened as if the sound mattered more than the person playing it, and that intrigued him more than applause ever did. He made a light remark about how everyone always expected perfection, and joked that maybe someone else should try the piano for a change, and laughter followed as people looked around, amused and unsure. And then, almost without thinking, Daniel gestured toward Clara and said she looked like someone who understood music. The room quieted slightly, and Clara felt every eye turned toward her, and her first instinct was to refuse, to shrink back and disappear. But something held her in place, perhaps pride, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps the simple fact that she was tired of always saying no. She smiled politely and shook her head gently, saying she was just passing through and that she was no one special. And Daniel laughed kindly and said that being ordinary did not mean being incapable, and that the piano was not a stage at that moment but an invitation. Some people chuckled, assuming the exchange was playful and harmless, And Clara could feel the old familiar fear rising, the fear of being seen and measured and found lacking. And she considered leaving then and there, but the sound of the piano still lingered in her chest like an unanswered question. Daniel sensed her hesitation and softened his tone, saying it was only for fun and that mistakes were welcome, and that music was meant to be shared, not judged. And his words were sincere though casual, and they stirred something Clara had buried under years of careful living. She took a step forward, then another, and with each movement her heart beat louder and the room seemed to narrow, until there was only the piano and the memory of her father beside her, reminding her to trust her hands. As she reached the bench, she hesitated once more, and Daniel stepped aside, giving her space. And the respect in that gesture surprised her, because he did not guide her or instruct her, and instead he waited as if he trusted her choice completely. Clara sat down slowly and placed her hands in her lap, and the keys in front of her looked both familiar and distant, like an old friend seen after years apart. And she closed her eyes briefly, not to perform, but to remember. The room grew quiet, not with anticipation, but with curiosity, and Daniel leaned against the wall, watching without expectation, and without the need to control the moment. And for the first time that day, Clara felt no pressure to impress or prove anything. She lifted her hands and rested her fingers on the keys, and the touch sent a quiet shiver through her, because the muscle memory was still there, waiting patiently. And she pressed the first key gently, and the sound filled the room with warmth that surprised even her. She did not play fast or loud, and she did not choose a complex piece, and instead she played something simple and honest, shaped by feeling rather than technique, and the melody unfolded naturally, like a story spoken aloud without fear. As the music continued, the room changed, and whispers stopped, and even the city noise outside seemed to fade, and Daniel straightened slowly, realizing that what he was hearing carried depth he had not expected, and that the joke he had made had opened a door he did not know existed. Clara played without looking at anyone, and her shoulders relaxed as each note followed the next. And for the first time in years, she was not a clerk or a daughter or a woman defined by restraint, and she was simply herself, returning to something that had never truly left her. When the final note faded, she let her hands rest on the keys and did not move immediately, and the silence that followed was full and respectful. And Daniel felt something shift inside him, because he recognized that he had witnessed something rare and deeply human. Clara opened her eyes and stood quietly, unsure of what to do next. And for a moment no one spoke, and then someone exhaled softly, and Daniel nodded once, not as a performer acknowledging applause, but as one musician recognizing enough. She stepped away from the piano and moved toward the door with her heart still racing, and Daniel watched her go, knowing that the moment had already changed him, and though neither of them understood it, yet that simple exchange would grow into something far greater than a passing challenge. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without the Clara walked out of the side chamber and into the open square with her breath uneven and her hands trembling slightly, and she did not know whether she was shaking from fear, relief, or something closer to grief, because what she had just done felt both brave and reckless in a way her life had not allowed for many years. She expected the moment to end the instant she stepped outside, and for the sound and attention to disappear behind the heavy doors, yet it followed her quietly inside her chest. And with every step she felt the echo of the keys under her fingers, as if the piano had left a mark on her that could not be erased. People passed her without knowing what had happened, and that anonymity felt strange, because moments earlier strangers had watched her bear something deeply personal. And now the world continued as if nothing had changed, and she realized that the most meaningful moments often left no visible trace. Inside the hall, Daniel remained still long after Clara left, and the small crowd lingered as well, unsure of how to respond, because the playful atmosphere had shifted into something more reflective, and a few people exchanged looks before quietly leaving, as if instinctively respecting the weight of what had just occurred. Daniel returned to the piano slowly and sat down again, but he did not play right away, and instead he rested his hands on the bench and stared at the keys, because the sound she had produced was still alive in his ears, and it unsettled him in a way applause never had. He had spent years perfecting technique, mastering timing and control, yet what he had just heard carried something else, something unpolished but deeply true, and it forced him to confront an uncomfortable thought that perhaps he had been performing more than feeling. A staff member approached, asking if he wanted to continue rehearsal, and Daniel shook his head gently and said not yet. And when the room cleared, he played a few notes, trying to return to his earlier piece, but it felt distant and empty compared to what had just filled the space. Clara boarded the train back to her part of town earlier than planned, and she sat by the window watching the city slide past, and memories surfaced, uninvited images of her younger self practicing late at night, of her father listening quietly of the day. She closed the piano lid for the last time, believing she was choosing responsibility over self. She had not planned to think about music again, And yet here it was demanding her attention, reminding her that some parts of a person waited patiently rather than disappearing. At home, she placed her bag down and stood in the middle of her living room, unsure of what to do next, and the silence felt louder than usual. And she found herself sitting on the edge of the couch staring at the wall, replaying the moment Daniel had stepped aside and trusted her without knowing her. That trust stayed with her and unsettled her because it contrasted sharply with the years she had spent doubting herself and minimizing her abilities. And she wondered how many choices she had avoided simply because no one had invited her to try. Meanwhile, Daniel canceled his afternoon meetings, something he rarely did, and took a long walk through the city without direction. And he thought about the expression on Clara's face when she played the mix of restraint and release, and he realized that it mirrored something he had been feeling but had not known how to name. He had always been praised for brilliance but rarely asked about honesty, and watching her play without concern for recognition reminded him of the reason he had first touched the piano as a child, when music was exploration rather than expectation. That evening, the concert hall filled with guests and anticipation, and Daniel performed flawlessly as always, yet something subtle had changed in his playing. And though the audience responded warmly, he knew the shift was internal and unresolved. Clara did not attend the concert, and instead she sat at home listening to the quiet, and finally opened a small storage bench near the window where she kept old photographs, and beneath them lay a folded cloth wrapped carefully around a set of yellowed sheet music, and her fingers lingered there before pulling it free. She did not open the music that night, but the act of holding it felt significant, like reopening a door without stepping through it yet. As the night settled, both Clara and Daniel lay awake in different parts of the city, each carrying the same unspoken understanding that something meaningful had begun, not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably. And neither of them yet knew that the brief playful challenge would soon grow into a connection that would test identity, pride, and the meaning of true artistry. Clara returned to her routine the next morning, yet the routine no longer fit her the same way because the quiet had changed shape, and instead of protecting her from memory, it now invited it. And as she prepared for work, she noticed how often her thoughts drifted back to the piano and to the sound she had released without planning. At the office, her coworkers spoke about ordinary things, deadlines, lunch plans, weather, and Clara nodded and smiled as expected. Yet inside she felt detached, as if part of her had remained in that side chamber beside the piano and was waiting patiently for her to return. During her lunch break, she walked farther than usual and past a small music shop she had never entered before, and without fully deciding, she stepped inside, and the smell of wood and polish wrapped around her instantly and stirred something tender and familiar. She did not buy anything and she did not speak much, but she asked the owner if there were any public practice rooms in the area. And the question surprised even her, because it was the first outward sign that she was considering music again. That same afternoon, Daniel received an email from a friend who had been in the side chamber that morning, and the message was brief, but sincere, saying that what he had witnessed felt more meaningful than any formal concert. And Daniel read it twice, feeling both gratitude and unease. He realized that the encounter with Clara had followed him into every practice session since, and that his hands hesitated where they once moved automatically, as if asking a question his mind had avoided for years. He canceled another rehearsal and instead sat alone at the piano in his apartment and played without structure, letting the sound wander and break and breathe. And in doing so, he recognized how rarely he allowed himself that freedom. Clara visited her mother that evening and listened as she spoke about health and small concerns, and then unexpectedly her mother asked if Clara had played the piano recently, and the question landed gently but directly, and Clara felt tears rise without warning. She admitted that she had played again, even if only once, and her mother smiled softly and said she had always known Clara would return when she was ready, and those words settled deeply because they carried no pressure, only trust. In the days that followed, Clara sought out a small community center that offered access to an upright piano, and the first time she entered the room alone, she sat quietly for several minutes before touching the keys, allowing herself to feel fear without judgment. When she finally played, the sound was uneven and imperfect, yet deeply comforting, and she played until her hands tired and her mind cleared. And when she left, she felt lighter than she had in years. Daniel, meanwhile, requested access to the hall outside of scheduled hours and began experimenting with small informal sessions open to the public without announcement. And he found himself hoping, though he did not admit it, that Clara might appear again. Their lives continued on separate paths, yet a quiet thread connected them, one shaped by shared recognition rather than intention. And as each explored what music meant to them, now they moved closer to truth neither could avoid much longer. Clara began visiting the community center 3 evenings a week. And at first she chose the latest hour when the building was nearly empty, because she still carried the habit of hiding her passion, but slowly as days passed, she stopped worrying about who might hear and focused instead on how the music made her feel whole again. Her playing grew steadier not because she practiced harder but because she trusted herself more, and she allowed mistakes to exist without shame. And this freedom changed the way she listened to sound, noticing emotion rather than precision and memory rather than performance. One evening, a young girl stood quietly in the doorway listening, and Clara noticed her reflection in the piano surface and stopped playing, but the girl smiled and asked softly if she could listen more. And Clara nodded, realizing that her music was already reaching others without effort. At the concert hall, Daniel continued his informal sessions, and though attendance was small, the conversations were deep and sincere, and people spoke about how music made them feel rather than how impressive it sounded. And Daniel found himself listening more than playing, which felt unfamiliar but necessary. He thought often about Clara and wondered if she understood the impact of that moment on him, and whether she had returned to music or closed the door again. And this uncertainty stayed with him, gently pushing him toward reflection. One afternoon, Daniel decided to walk through the city without purpose, and he found himself near the community center without planning it. And when he heard piano music drifting through an open window, he stopped immediately because the sound carried warmth and honesty that felt unmistakable. He did not enter right away, and instead listened from outside, allowing the music to exist without interruption. And when it ended, he waited, unsure whether to step forward or walk away. Clara stepped outside moments later carrying her bag, and when she saw Daniel standing there, she froze, surprised and uncertain, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because words felt unnecessary. Daniel finally said that he had recognized her playing and thanked her for reminding him why he loved music, and Clara felt emotion rise, but she smiled calmly and said she was only rediscovering something she had forgotten. They walked together, slowly speaking about simple things: music, memory, choice, and fear, and the conversation flowed easily without expectation. And for the first time, Clara did not feel ordinary in the way she once had, but grounded and complete. This meeting marked a turning point, not dramatic, not public, but deeply personal, and both of them understood that whatever followed would require honesty, patience, and courage. After their unexpected meeting outside the community center, Clara returned home with a feeling she could not easily name, because it was not excitement and not fear, but something steadier and deeper, like recognition. And she slept that night without replaying old regrets for the first time in many years. The next morning she woke earlier than usual, and instead of rushing through her routine, she moved slowly, allowing herself to feel present. And when she reached for her coat, she paused and realized she was humming a melody she had played the night before, and that small detail made her smile. Daniel also felt the shift, and he noticed it in the way his hands rested on the piano keys that morning without urgency, and he allowed silence between notes, something he had avoided for years, and the space made the music feel more honest. They did not exchange contact information that evening, and that choice felt right, because it kept the moment clean and unforced, yet both of them wondered if they would meet again, and trusted that if it was meant to happen, it would. Days passed, and Clara continued her visits to the community center, and she began playing earlier in the evening when others were present. And she noticed that people listened not with judgment but curiosity, and she allowed herself to acknowledge their presence without shrinking. One evening, the coordinator asked if Clara would consider playing during an upcoming open house, and the request stirred old fear but also confidence, and she asked for time to think instead of refusing immediately, and that pause itself felt like growth. Daniel announced another informal session at the hall, and this time Clara attended, quietly sitting near the back and listening, not as a participant but as a witness. And she noticed how his playing had softened and how his expression carried less performance and more vulnerability. After the session, they spoke again, briefly exchanging thoughts about sound and silence, and the way music revealed what words could not, and this time Daniel asked if Clara would like to stay in touch, and she agreed without hesitation. Their conversations grew slowly through shared walks and quiet cafes and discussions about life choices and identity, and they spoke honestly about fear and loss, and the cost of success and restraint, and through these conversations they challenged one another gently. Clara began to consider what it would mean to choose music not as a career, but as a living presence, and Daniel reflected on how fame had shaped his distance from authenticity. And together, they explored a middle space where artistry and humanity could coexist. As weeks passed, the open house approached, and Clara decided to play not to impress but to share. And when she told Daniel, he supported her choice without offering guidance or critique, and that trust strengthened her resolve. The evening arrived, and the room filled with neighbors and children and familiar faces, and Clara sat at the piano with calm steadiness, and played with honesty, allowing her sound to carry her story without explanation. The response was quiet and sincere, and Clara felt grounded rather than exposed, and Daniel watched from the back, recognizing that her courage had reshaped his understanding of greatness. When the message ends, you can write continue, and I will carry on. Clara felt a quiet shift after the open house, not because of praise or attention, but because she had shared something true without losing herself. And that balance stayed with her in the days that followed as she returned to work and routine with a steadier presence. At the office, her coworkers noticed a change in her posture and tone, and though nothing in her role had changed, she spoke with more clarity and ease, and she no longer felt the need to apologize for taking space, and this subtle confidence surprised even her. Daniel watched these changes from his own distance, and he admired how Clara navigated growth without spectacle, and it challenged his long-held belief that impact required visibility and acclaim, and he began questioning how much of his life had been shaped by expectation rather than choice. Their conversations deepened, and they spoke about moments of decision that altered direction and about the fear of disappointing others, and they discovered shared values around integrity, patience, and respect for process. And these shared values formed a foundation stronger than admiration. Clara continued playing at the community center, and she began inviting others to join her, creating informal sessions where people shared music stories in silence, and she found fulfillment in facilitating connection rather than standing apart. Daniel attended one of these sessions quietly and observed how Clara guided without control and listened without judgment, and he recognized a form of leadership he had rarely encountered, and it reshaped his understanding of influence. As the season changed, Daniel faced a decision about an upcoming international tour that promised prestige but demanded emotional distance and relentless performance, and for the first time he questioned whether accepting it aligned with who he was becoming. Clara supported his reflection without steering his choice and reminded him that pausing was not failure, and this simple reassurance allowed him to consider alternatives he had once dismissed. Meanwhile, Clara received an offer from the community center to expand the music program, and the responsibility felt daunting yet meaningful, and she considered how her life might change if she accepted. They stood at a crossroads individually and together, and both understood that growth required courage, not just to begin, but to sustain. When the message ends, you can write continue and I will carry on. Clara accepted the offer from the community center after several nights of careful thought, not because she felt ready, but because she trusted the quiet confidence that had grown inside her. And the decision did not feel dramatic. It felt grounded, like choosing a direction after standing still for too long. Her role began modestly, organizing schedules, welcoming participants, listening to their needs, and slowly shaping a space where music felt accessible rather than intimidating. And she discovered that her own journey allowed others to feel safe enough to begin theirs. Daniel watched her step into this responsibility with calm admiration, and it challenged his own hesitation. And after long reflection, he declined the international tour, choosing instead to focus on fewer performances that allowed for depth and connection. And the decision surprised many, but brought him a sense of relief he had not expected. They spoke openly about these choices, acknowledging the uncertainty and supporting one another without attachment to outcome. And this balance strengthened their bond because it was rooted in respect rather than dependency. As months passed, their paths intertwined more naturally, and they collaborated on small projects, blending Daniel's experience with Clara's grounded approach. And the work felt meaningful without being heavy, and joyful without being performative. People who attended these gatherings often remarked on the warmth and sincerity of the atmosphere, and neither Clara nor Daniel sought credit, understanding that the space itself mattered more than recognition. Through shared effort, they both learned that fulfillment came not from proving worth, but from aligning action with values, and this understanding carried them forward into a future shaped by intention rather than expectation. Clara stood in the quiet room one evening after everyone had left the community center, and the chairs were stacked and the lights were dimmed, and she felt a deep sense of completion, not because the journey had ended, but because it had finally aligned with who she truly was. She thought about the woman she had been before the day she walked past the concert hall, carrying responsibility like armor. And she understood now that strength did not come from silence or sacrifice alone, but from allowing space for what mattered most. Daniel arrived shortly after, carrying 2 cups of tea, and they sat together, without speaking for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. And this shared silence felt rich and full, because it carried understanding rather than distance. They reflected on how a simple, joking challenge had unfolded into something neither of them could have planned, and how that moment had stripped away roles and titles and expectations, leaving only truth and choice. Daniel spoke about how his relationship with music had changed, and how he no longer felt the need to impress rooms, but to connect with them. And Clara listened, knowing that her own path had mirrored that shift in its own quiet way. Together, they planned future projects not as ambitions, but as invitations, creating spaces where music served people rather than ego, and where participation mattered more than perfection. As seasons passed, their work touched many lives quietly and steadily, And Clara watched others discover courage at the piano, just as she once had, and Daniel supported these moments with humility and respect. They never framed their story as extraordinary, because it was rooted in ordinary choices made with honesty and care. And that grounded truth became the foundation of everything they built. On a calm evening, Clara returned to the concert hall where it had all begun, and stood once more near the piano, remembering how her hands had trembled and how courage had found her in. She placed her fingers gently on the keys and played not for surprise or recognition, but for gratitude and peace, and the sound filled the empty space with warmth. Daniel listened from the doorway, smiling, quietly knowing that the greatest performance he had ever witnessed was not about mastery, but about reclaiming self. Their lives continued, shaped by intention, connection, and shared respect. And the story that once began as a challenge lived on as a testament to listening, courage, and the power of choosing authenticity. Write continue if you want me to extend this to the full requested length without breaking flow.